Hey guys, it's good to be with you today. We're getting close to the end of a section in the book of Mark that's called the Way section. You might remember we talked about this before, but starting at the end of Mark chapter 8 through this part of the book of Mark, Jesus and his disciples have been on a journey to Jerusalem. They've been on the way to Jerusalem. And as they've been traveling, Jesus has been teaching everyone about the nature of his calling and his mission. Now, I want you to notice in verse 32 that there's some very interesting language. As they were on their way to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Now, normally, when the word astonished is used in the book of Mark, it's because Jesus has just performed a miracle. But in this case, the word astonished is used because Jesus has made a decision. Jesus is taking a risk going to Jerusalem. Perhaps for the first time, the rest of Jesus' traveling party now is beginning to realize that Jesus is not going to lead his underground movement from the fringes like he's been doing in the past. At this point and going forward, he is heading into the power base of the religious establishment and the Romans. He's going to Jerusalem, and you don't have to be the Son of God to anticipate what's going to happen next. There's about to be a showdown. This is why the disciples are astonished and the people are afraid. Jesus is going to Jerusalem. I don't think we give Jesus enough credit for the courage he displayed. We tend to focus on what Jesus' death means for us and our salvation, and we absolutely should. But we can't just focus on Jesus' death. We need to focus on his life, and we need to recognize how much courage Jesus had. It needs to be an example for us. He's our role model. I want you to note how clearly Jesus explains what's going to happen to him when he gets to Jerusalem. He says, "We're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise." Now, this is the third time during his journey to Jerusalem that Jesus has predicted his death. So you might guess that Jesus' disciples were finally starting to understand the nature of his call to be the Messiah. He wasn't going to be the triumphant Messiah that they had assumed he would be. He was going to be the suffering servant prophesied about in the book of Isaiah. But of course, that's not what happens. In verse 35, James and John come to Jesus and they say to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." And he says, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." Now, you have to wonder, did they remember the things he just said about being mocked and spit on and flogged and killed? They didn't understand. James and John had heard everything Jesus said about suffering, but somehow they didn't connect Jesus' words to the reality Jesus was going to experience when he got to Jerusalem. Sort of like Peter in Mark chapter 8, they thought that this kind of suffering was beneath Jesus because he was the Messiah. They thought that because Jesus was the Messiah, he was going to have power and authority, and they wanted to share in that power and authority. Now, Jesus responds to James and John less harshly than he did to Peter. I mean, almost anything Jesus would have said to James and John would have been less harsh than he was with Peter. I mean, he literally called Peter Satan. But he does let James and John know that his kingdom is not like the kingdoms of this earth. Repeating a theme he first mentioned in Mark chapter 9, Jesus said, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all." We still need to hear Jesus' words today. As we've talked about previously, there is a temptation to pursue Jesus for our benefit rather than for his glory. We want Jesus, but we don't want to take up Jesus' cross. We don't want to go to Jerusalem and risk suffering and being mocked at the hands of those in positions of power. We want to stay in our safe churches outside of the public view. And yet, if we're going to be Jesus' disciples, we must be willing to follow Jesus wherever he leads and do whatever he does, even if he calls us to go to Jerusalem. James and John wanted Jesus to be the king with authority, but instead, Jesus described himself in terms that are truly astonishing. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. We follow the one who possessed all authority and had every right to be first, and yet he was willing to be a suffering servant. So, what about us? What about you? Are you willing to follow Jesus' example? Are you willing to become a servant? As followers of Jesus, we must follow Jesus with the courage that Jesus possessed. Again, he's our role model. Our Christian life can't just be about someday when we die, we're going to heaven. It has to be here on earth as we live, we're going to Jerusalem. we're going to suffer. And the question is, do we have enough courage to be a servant like Jesus?